From the outside looking in, I was a very happy and healthy child. I had many different hobbies and activities that I loved doing. I loved reading, I loved swimming, I loved gymnastics, and I loved hanging out with my friends. However, something changed that. I lost that light inside of me when my eating disorder took over. As mentioned, I will be discussing my eating disorder recovery journey with you today, and I will do so in the most responsible way possible. That means there'll be no before and after photos, there'll be no triggering details or explicit details about what behaviors I went through. Instead, I'm going to stick with the overall picture, how I felt, how it impacted others around me. I know what you're thinking. As soon as I said gymnastics, there's like a little light bulb and people go, well, obviously that's how you developed an eating disorder, was through gymnastics. There's a pressure to look thin, pressure to look a certain way. It makes sense. But gymnastics saved me from my eating disorder. And let me explain why. It was actually my gymnastics coach at the time who started to notice the red flags. And rather than pull me aside and make a comment about my weight or what I was eating, he simply asked, "How are you doing?" He approached me from a human-to-human perspective. And at the time, my brain was starved. I was not thinking clearly at all. And so, of course, I was in denial. And you know, denial is a really interesting thing because for most people who are very sick, they want to get better, they want to improve. But for someone with an eating disorder, they can't even recognize that they're sick in the first place. And this intervention, I wish I could say that it led to an instant overnight transformation and I got better, but that wasn't the case at all. It was a lot of slow, steady steps. I spoke with a school counselor. She was concerned. Again, I was in denial. And then I was referred to the family doctor. Then finally, I was referred to an outpatient treatment for eating disorders. And with the support of my family, I got to the point where I was able to graduate from that program and go off to university. Unfortunately there, I was stuck in a cycle again, and it seemed like it was never ending, but things were really starting to get better. From the outside, again, it looked like there was nothing wrong. I was able to maintain a full course load. I was able to go off and work in health communications. And then the pandemic. It felt like overnight, there was something in my brain that just switched. And immediately I was back to being that 15-year-old girl, scared, helpless, totally afraid. The eating disorder came roaring back and it was worse than ever. This image here shows a lot of different ways why people with eating disorders may have relapsed over the pandemic or even had an onset of an eating disorder. And there were three things in particular that stood out to me. The first one being there was a heightened anxiety around grocery store shopping. If we think back to 2020, we were told, don't go out unless it's absolutely necessary. And by the way, when you go, there's gonna be an hour wait, you'll get in, and there'll be barely any food on the shelves. I already hated grocery shopping, so this idea, I was like, so you're telling me not to go? Okay, I won't. I'll just stick with what I have. Bad idea. The second thing that stands out to me in this image was loss of routine. I was used to going and being around people and having some sort of order to my day where we'd eat around a similar time, come back, have dinner, go to sleep, that sort of thing. However, with my high-stress job in health communications, I was working and all the hours and the minutes, they all sort of blurred together. Did I mention I was living in a basement apartment? That probably didn't help much, and I was living alone. Which brings me to my third point, the isolation. Because of this isolation and the health warnings around not being able to go see in-person care, that meant that there was no one I was held accountable to. It was just me. There was no one else to notice that, oh, maybe you should stock up your pantry a little bit more. And that was a really, really scary feeling. There was a lot of impacts on me at that time, and the one memory I remember so vividly is I wasn't sleeping well. I had horrible dreams and nightmares, and so I would just scroll on my phone. And it was one night where it was 3 a.m., and it was like, I am so exhausted. I do not want to be in this cycle for the rest of my life. It was almost like I flashed forward and saw me being stuck like this. And so I remembered when I was a teenager and going through all that work, and I thought, you know what, if I did it already, I can probably do it again. And fortunately, I had the support of my family. Shout out to my mom who's in the audience today. And by opening up to them and letting them know what was going on, they helped support me financially, so I was able to find a therapist who worked virtually to offer specific eating disorder-informed care. This was a breakthrough because here I was going through eating disorder recovery as an adult, and during the pandemic, when I realized, wait a second, it's not just me having struggles. There are so many other people who are also facing difficulty with their own mental health. And my therapist also recognized that, and she said, you know, you've been so secretive about this for so long, wouldn't there be some relief in opening up a little bit, besides to a therapist? And yeah, I think that was a really great idea. Having a background in writing, in communications, writing was always my go-to form of communications, and so I figured, why don't I start a blog? Why don't I start talking about what's going on? It'll be very small, very casual. I'll create a sense of community for other people going through eating disorders. I'll dispel some of the stereotypes and the stigmas, and I'll hold myself accountable. So I created this blog, and I really didn't think it was special. But that's the problem, because if you're someone with a severe mental illness like an eating disorder and you don't think you're special, well then you're not, right? And you minimize what you're going through, and you downplay the symptoms, and you compare yourself to people who have it worse. That's exactly what I did. However, hitting publish on that blog was the opposite effect. Rather than just my family and my friends reaching out, I realized by sharing the uniqueness of my journey, I was creating a greater sense of community. There were people from high school who I hadn't spoken to in like a decade, reaching out to say, I also had an eating disorder at the same time as you, and we never realized. There were people on LinkedIn sending me messages to say, hey, I have a family member with an eating disorder. Thank you for sharing this. And most surprisingly were the strangers. I still remember one message on Twitter who was a young professional, also living in Toronto. Hey, this really spoke to me. And that made me think, you know, maybe there's more potential to this blog. Maybe I can turn it into a bigger platform and use my voice to continue talking about eating disorders in a responsible and informed manner. Well, it's been 2 years now since my first post, and the blog is actually starting to take a smaller role in my life. However, what I really, really love doing, part of it's because of my background in journalism, is I love interviewing other people for my blog. And so one of the events that I focused on last year was Men's Health Month. I decided to speak to 2 men who had eating disorders, and what they told me broke my heart. For so many years, they were told by their own doctors, boys don't get eating disorders. There's nothing wrong with you. When they finally received diagnoses and went to treatment, they were the only men in the room, and a lot of the treatment wasn't tailored to their own experience. It was so brave of them to open up. I felt, you know, this is probably what people experience when they read about my writing, because I felt like I wasn't making a difference, and here I was witnessing this effect that these others were having on me. But you know, the blog is such a small part because I speak now and I open up, and that hasn't happened overnight. It's taken so much time to get here. In fact, when I was a Western student in journalism and communications, I remembered we had to go around in a circle and say where we wanted to intern. In my head, I knew I wanted to intern at an eating disorder agency, but I physically could not say that out loud. So I didn't say anything. I just skipped my turn. That was how scared and terrified I was. I was scared people would judge me, that they would think different things about me, and so I didn't say anything. There are 3 things that really helped me get to this point where I can be more open and where I finally found my voice. And the first one being super uncomfortable with being comfortable or comfortable with being uncomfortable. I will admit this has been a hard month mental health-wise, and even earlier this week, there were moments where I didn't think I would be up on this stage. I didn't think I was the right person to speak to this topic. And so I realized that by staying quiet and not talking about my eating disorder, that is worse. That is much worse, living in the secrecy, letting that eating disorder voice take over. And the second thing is tapping into your own skill sets and expertise. So for me, that was writing. The blog came natural, and that was my way of expressing to the world what I was going on with my mental illness. And for others, it may be art, it may be podcasting. There's so many different outlets that we can share what we're going through to create different community. And you have to like what you're doing. If you hate public speaking, don't public speak. I love writing, and that's why I do that. And then finally, the third piece that helped me find my helped me gain strength with my eating disorder is really just, allowing myself to recognize that this is a universal experience. Eating disorders are not as unique as you may think. There's over 2.7 million Canadians who have eating disorders. That is around the population of Toronto. It is a significant amount of people. I'm super proud to share a couple highlights that happened over the past year. Few of them being speaking at conferences. I was at a leadership conference. I'm like, I'm not a leader. Again, this is how the eating disorder impacts you. It tells you that you're worthless. It tells you that you're not good. So by doing these sort of things, I'm standing up for myself. I've spoken at orientation weeks where when I was in school, there was no mention of mental health, and it felt so empowering to break that silence and normalize something that a lot of people go through. I've done media interviews. I've been published in Canada's most read newspaper, the Toronto Star. And probably most fun of all was I turned a bridge purple. That was really cool. It was for Eating Disorder Awareness Week, and I just sent an email to the Peace Bridge to see if they would turn it purple. It was so neat. It was literally a physical manifestation of the advocacy work that I had been doing. I know I come across as a very positive and uplifting person, but the truth of the matter is eating disorders are really, really serious. They are the second most deadly mental illness next to opioid use disorder. And the reason for that is the medical complications and high risk of suicide. Let's say there are about 100 people in this room right now. If I ask 80 of you to leave and there's 20 people left, those 20 people, they represent the percentage of people with eating disorders who are able to get help. Those other 80, they just sort of, like me, float in and out of recovery, relapse, and attempt to live a fulfilling life, which is really, really challenging. And being here, standing on this stage, is a reminder that recovery is possible. I am living proof of that. I don't want this to be something where I unload, my very personal story of one of the worst things that happened to me, something that tried to kill me. Instead, I want to use this as a platform to keep the momentum going. You may not realize this, but we all are, part of this greater picture of people impacted by eating disorders. If there's one takeaway for you today, I want it to be that you never, ever, ever comment on someone else's body. Even with the purest of intentions, you don't know what they're going through. You don't know how they'll take it. From my own experience and the comments I've had about my body, especially as an athlete, I still remember those, and other people have said the same thing. It also takes time, or is great for us to reflect internally. We all have bodies. We all eat food. Bad body image days happen to all of us, and so in some way we can empathize with those who have eating disorders. I also continue to educate myself, whether it's learning and unlearning different ways that fat phobia, diet culture, the ways that those show up in our lives and make eating disorders perpetuated and even glorified in some senses. I can't talk about eating disorders without sharing resources. And this is the go-to in Canada. It's a National Eating Disorder Information Center. They have all sorts of supports there, whether you're an educator, whether you're a coach, whether you're a family member. And I encourage everyone to check it out, even just for your own education. So as I wrap up, I have to, take a second to acknowledge the timing of this talk. In a few days, it'll be February, and February is Eating Disorders Awareness Month. When I was a first-year student, they had maybe one event on Eating Disorders Awareness Month, and I was like, oh, do I go? Do I not go? So I actually snuck in the back of it and just sat there really quietly, didn't tell any of my housemates that I went there. But then now I'm hearing these conversations of people not being scared to own what they're going through. And I think that's another takeaway, that all of us have powerful voices, and our voices can be used as instruments of change, especially through responsible storytelling when it comes to mental illness. Thank you so much.